When the HOA threw a WW2 Veterans Memorial in the trash, calling it debris, they had no idea they had just crossed the line of no return. Their arrogant leader, Susan Langley, had built her power on enforcing petty rules. But this time, she had messed with the wrong family. Because Jack Henderson wasn't just a grieving grandson, he had one phone call that would change everything. And what happened next didn't just destroy Susan. It sent shockwaves through the entire system that had protected people like her. Jack Henderson had dealt with a lot of HOA nonsense over the years. The passive-aggressive emails, the condescending violation notices for things so minor they were barely perceptible. His mailbox a shade too dark, his truck parked 3 inches too far to the left, a single blade of grass that had the audacity to grow taller than the others. He had gritted his teeth through it all, knowing the fight wasn't worth it. Let them have their little power trips. Let them pretend they ran the world because they had a title in a homeowners association. But this was different. This wasn't about a stupid regulation or a petty fine. This was about his family. This was about his grandfather, the man who had fought in World War II, who had survived battles. Most people only read about in history books. A man who had given his blood, his youth, and pieces of his soul for his country, only for his memory to be trashed by some HOA tyrant with a superiority complex. Jack's stomach twisted the second he pulled into his driveway. Something was wrong. It wasn't immediate panic, just a vague, creeping sense of unease, the kind that made his skin prickle before his brain even caught up. His eyes scanned his front yard, searching for the source of the disturbance. And then he saw it. Or rather, he didn't. The memorial, his grandfather's memorial. The handcrafted wooden casket, built decades ago by his great-grandfather, passed down through generations, was gone. Jack's breath hitched. His heart stuttered. No, that didn't make sense. For a moment he thought maybe he was looking in the wrong spot. Maybe someone had moved it. Maybe a strong wind had knocked it over. But deep down, he already knew. His stomach churned as his gaze snapped toward the end of the street, where a garbage truck sat, its mechanical arm lowering after just having dumped a fresh load into the compactor. His mouth went dry. No. Jack threw open his truck door and bolted, barely aware of the door slamming shut behind him. His boots pounded against the pavement as he sprinted toward the sanitation workers, his pulse roaring in his ears. Hey! His voice was raw, desperate, almost unrecognizable. Hey, stop! One of the workers, a middle-aged guy in an orange vest, sweat beading on his forehead beneath a grime-stained baseball cap, turned around. He wiped his brow with the back of his glove, his expression unreadable at first. Then Jack saw it. Pity. A cold, sinking weight settled in Jack's chest. No, please, no. He skidded to a stop, breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. Did you? His voice cracked. He swallowed hard and tried again. Did you guys pick up something from my porch? A wooden casket? Big dark oak, had a flag draped over it. The worker hesitated. For a second, Jack hoped, he was going to say no, that this was all just some stupid mistake, that the memorial was somewhere else, safe, waiting for him to find it. But then the guy sighed, shifted his weight, gave a small, reluctant nod. Yeah, he admitted. HOA told us it was debris. Jack's body locked up. Said it was a Halloween prop someone forgot to take down. A Halloween prop. A Halloween prop. Jack froze. Everything around him faded. The distant chirp of birds, the hum of the garbage truck, the faint laughter of neighborhood kids riding their bikes. It all vanished. Because right now, there was only this moment. Only this reality. The reality where his grandfather's memory, his family's legacy, had been thrown away like garbage. His fists clenched so hard his knuckles cracked. His nails bit into his palms, but he barely felt it. A slow, burning heat unfurled in his chest, creeping up his spine like wildfire. This wasn't the kind of anger that came in quick bursts and faded just as fast. No, this was fury, the kind that sank its claws deep, turned rational thought into static, the kind that made his vision tunnel and his heart hammer so hard it felt like his ribs might snap. A Halloween prop. His grandfather survived Nazis, but now his memory had been erased by some HOA bureaucrat with too much time on their hands. Jack's blood turned to fire. Jack didn't remember parking his truck, didn't remember throwing the door open or stomping across the pavement with the kind of purpose that made people move out of his way. The world around him was a blur, background noise drowned out by the roaring fire in his head. All he knew was that his hands were shaking, not from fear, not from grief, from pure, unfiltered rage. It wasn't the kind of anger that came in quick, reckless bursts, the kind that made you punch walls and scream into the void. No, this was something deeper, something heavier, a slow-burning, bone-deep fury that settled in his chest like molten steel, the kind of rage that made men dangerous. And right now, Jack was very, very dangerous. The second he reached the HOA office, he shoved the glass door open so hard it smacked against the wall with a loud crack. A couple of people waiting inside flinched. The receptionist, a young woman with dark-rimmed glasses and an apologetic smile, looked up, blinking at him in surprise. "Sir," she started, but Jack wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on her. Susan Langley, the woman who had single-handedly desecrated his grandfather's memory. The woman who had decided, without a second thought, that a man's legacy was nothing more than debris. She was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, completely at ease, sipping a fresh cup of coffee like she didn't have a care in the world, as if she wasn't responsible for the firestorm currently raging in his chest. Like she hadn't just thrown his family's history into the trash. Jack crossed the room in 3 long strides, and then, with all the force his rage could muster, he slammed his fists onto the counter. The sound was thunderous. The receptionist jumped. A stack of neatly arranged HOA newsletters fluttered to the floor. A man sitting in the waiting area actually dropped his phone. But Susan? She didn't even flinch, didn't even look up. Instead, she sighed, a long, drawn-out sound, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience, before finally, lazily, gracing him with her attention. "Can I help you?" she asked, in the same tone a DMV worker might use after their 3rd hour of dealing with irate customers. Jack's hands curled into fists, his fingernails dug into his palms. "Where is it?" Susan blinked. "Excuse me?" Jack could feel his pulse pounding against his temples, his breathing shallow and sharp. "My grandfather's memorial," he growled through clenched teeth. "The one you threw in the trash." Susan stared at him for a moment. Then she rolled her eyes. The sheer audacity of it almost made Jack lunge across the desk. "Oh," she said, voice dripping with boredom. "That old wooden box?" Jack's blood turned to ice. "Yes," he said, his voice a low snarl. Susan sniffed, setting down her coffee mug. "It was an eyesore," she said dismissively, as if that was explanation enough. "Didn't comply with community guidelines." The words barely registered. Jack's entire body locked up. He felt like he had just been punched in the gut, like the air had been ripped from his lungs. An eyesore, the handcrafted wooden casket that had been in his family for generations, the flag that had been folded by military hands, placed into his grandfather's arms on the day of his funeral, the medals that had been earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. An eyesore. Jack's jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached, his vision blurred at the edges, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. "You—" His voice cracked, but he forced the words out anyway. "You tossed a veterans memorial in the trash? A man who fought for this country, who bled for it?" Susan let out a long, dramatic sigh, leaning back in her chair like this entire conversation was exhausting her. "Calm down, Mr. Henderson," she said, waving her hand in a lazy, dismissive gesture. "We have rules for a reason. If we made an exception for every sentimental display, this neighborhood would look like a garage sale." A garage sale. Jack didn't even realize he had moved until he felt his fingernails bite into his palms. The rage inside him was no longer a wildfire. It was a hurricane, a tidal wave, a force of nature so powerful it could not be contained. He wanted to flip her desk over, wanted to shatter that stupid coffee mug just to see the smug expression finally wiped off her face. Wanted to grab her by the collar and drag her out into the street, make her look him in the eyes, and explain to his face why she had decided that his grandfather's memory wasn't worth preserving. But he didn't, because as much as he wanted to reduce this entire bureaucratic hellhole to ashes, he knew exactly what he had to do. And Susan Langley, she was about to find out. Jack wasn't just going to take this lying down. He had put up with the HOA's power-hungry nonsense for years, the stupid citations, the fines for parking his truck a few inches over the line, the passive-aggressive emails about maintaining aesthetic harmony in the neighborhood. But this wasn't about regulations. This was personal. His grandfather's memory had been thrown into the garbage like common trash, and Susan Langley had sat there, sipping her coffee, smirking like it was nothing. Jack had walked out of that HOA office before he did something that would land him in jail, but his rage was far from over. It was boiling, simmering under the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. And he knew exactly who to call. He pulled out his phone, fingers shaking with pure, controlled fury, and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he never thought he'd actually have to use. General Robert Henderson, retired 4-star general, legend in the military. Jack had grown up hearing the stories. His uncle had spent decades serving his country, commanding troops, negotiating high-stakes situations. He was a man who could snap his fingers and make entire bureaucracies tremble. If there was one person who could handle this, it was him. Jack pressed call. The line rang once, then twice. Then, on the third ring, a voice answered. Deep, steady. The kind of voice that made soldiers stand at attention even after all these years. Robert Henderson speaking. Jack swallowed, his throat tight. He hadn't talked to his uncle in a while, not out of bad blood, just out of the usual distance that grew between family members living separate lives. But now he needed him. Uncle Robert, Jack said, his voice hoarse. I need your help. There was a slight pause on the other end. Not impatience, not annoyance, just calculation. His uncle didn't speak until he had processed what he was hearing. What happened? General Henderson asked, tone sharp, all business. Jack gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm. The HOA, he ground out. He had to stop, take a breath. They threw away Grandpa's memorial. Silence. Jack could almost feel the shift in energy through the phone. The air around him seemed to thicken. His uncle hadn't spoken yet, but Jack knew he was about to. And when he did, it would be final. Explain, General Henderson said, voice like steel. Jack did. He told him everything. The casket-shaped display, the folded flag, the medals, how the HOA had deemed it debris, how they had told the garbage crew it was junk, how the woman who had done it, Susan Langley, that smug, power-tripping dictator, had laughed it off. By the time Jack finished, his heart was hammering so hard he could barely hear himself breathe. Then came the silence. It wasn't a hesitant silence. It wasn't uncertainty. It was the silence of a man deciding exactly how he was going to end someone's career. Then, finally, in a voice so calm it was terrifying, General Henderson spoke. I'll handle it. Jack exhaled, shoulders dropping slightly. He knew that tone. It was the tone of a man going to war. Jack didn't sleep much that night, not because he was anxious. Oh no, he was thrilled. Because if there was one thing he was sure of, it was this. When General Henderson said he'd handle something, he meant burn it to the ground and salt the earth. And Jack, he couldn't wait. The next morning, Jack woke up to chaos. He stepped outside and immediately froze. News vans lined the street. Reporters were everywhere, swarming like bees to honey. Cameramen, microphones, the whole 9 yards. Jack hadn't even had coffee yet, and then came the cherry on top. A military SUV pulled up to his house, black, government-issued, with 2 uniformed officers stepping out first. Then, a third door opened, and out stepped General Robert Henderson. The man looked ready for battle. Even in his civilian clothes, there was something about him that commanded instant respect. His broad frame, his sharp gaze, the way his presence alone made grown men shrink. Jack grinned. Susan Langley had no idea what was coming. Susan Langley had always been in control. For years, she ruled the HOA like a queen on a throne, dictating what color people could paint their houses, how many inches their grass could grow, and exactly how many approved seasonal decorations they could display. She thrived on the power, on the knowledge that no one would dare question her authority. But now she was trapped. The lights were blinding, hot against her skin. The cameras were trained on her, capturing every nervous flick of her eyes, every twitch of her lips. The reporters surrounded her like vultures, microphones shoved forward, voices overlapping, each question hitting like a bullet. And across from her, standing tall, unmoving, a force of nature, was General Robert Henderson. Susan had spent years making homeowners tremble under the weight of her HOA regulations. But standing before a decorated war hero, a man who had commanded armies and crushed governments with a single directive, she felt small. She forced a tight, practiced smile, but her lips quivered. "This is a simple misunderstanding," she began, her voice an octave too high. She cleared her throat, trying to steady herself, trying to regain control. "I assure you, the HOA was simply following community guidelines. The item in question was—" General Henderson took a step forward. The air changed, like the pressure had shifted, like the world had just been thrown off balance. "You threw away a piece of American history." Susan swallowed. "My father didn't fight in World War II," Henderson continued, his voice low, cold, and carrying the weight of a lifetime of service. "So bureaucratic, nobodies like you could treat his memory like garbage." Susan flinched. The crowd erupted. Murmurs turned to shouts. People craned their necks, whispering to each other, shaking their heads in disgust. Veterans in the crowd, men who had served, who knew what sacrifice truly meant, stared at her like she was the lowest of the low. The cameras zoomed in, the news anchors murmuring dramatic commentary into their microphones. The reporters pounced. "Are you going to apologize?" one called out. "Will the HOA compensate the family?" Another pressed, voice sharp. "How do you justify this insult to a veteran?" Susan's breathing hitched. Her usual arrogance, her untouchable superiority was crumbling in real time, and the world was watching. Her hands, normally still, composed, twitched at her sides. She tried to gather herself, tried to summon that snide, dismissive tone she had perfected over the years. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She was trapped, cornered like a rat in a cage. For the first time in her life, there was no HOA rule she could hide behind, no condescending email she could send, no fine she could slap on someone's front door to make the problem disappear. An asterisk, asterisk, then asterisk, asterisk. The final blow landed. One of the uniformed officers beside General Henderson stepped forward. A serious man, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, his military dress crisp, his boots polished to perfection. His voice was calm, controlled, and absolutely devastating. "The Pentagon has been notified," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is being classified as the desecration of a war hero's memorial." The blood drained from Susan Langley's face so fast, she looked like she might collapse. The fallout was instant. Within hours, the story exploded across the internet like wildfire. It was everywhere, on TV, news websites, social media. Every major outlet picked it up, the headlines growing more damning by the minute. HOA throws Veterans Memorial in the trash, family outraged, community board under fire for disrespecting war heroes' legacy. Pentagon responds to shocking HOA scandal. Officials condemn appalling act. Jack didn't even have to refresh his phone. The notifications poured in. Veteran organizations were furious. They issued statements, launched petitions, flooded the HOA's inbox with demands for accountability. Twitter, or whatever the hell they were calling it these days, erupted. #Hoa scandal, #justice for Walter Henderson, #respect our veterans. Hashtags trended nationwide. Thousands of people shared the story, each new post fueling the outrage. The comment sections were a bloodbath, filled with people calling for resignations, lawsuits, and even criminal charges. And then, the Pentagon stepped in. A formal statement from the Department of Defense hit the press that afternoon. The United States military strongly condemns the desecration of any veterans memorial. We stand with the Henderson family and all service members who have honorably served this nation. The memory of those who fought for our freedoms must be upheld with dignity and respect. Peso. Translation: the government was watching. Jack sat back, coffee in hand, watching the chaos unfold from his phone. Susan Langley, she was done. Her face was plastered across every major news station. Clips of her pathetic, stammering excuses at the press conference played on repeat, side by side with footage of General Henderson's cold, cutting words and the announcement of the federal investigation. The HOA tried to go silent. Their website crashed from the sheer volume of people flooding it, demanding answers. Their social media pages were locked down after receiving thousands of hate comments. They had nowhere to run. And then, the real bombshell dropped. Jack's phone buzzed. He glanced down at a new notification, his eyes scanning the screen. Breaking news. Hoa under federal investigation. Jack grinned. Oh, this just kept getting better. Because apparently, this wasn't the first time they had disposed of veterans' memorials in the name of community aesthetics. Oh no, this had been going on for years. Reporters dug deep into the HOA's past, and what they found was ugly. Multiple homeowners had filed complaints about missing military memorabilia, flags, plaques, even entire monuments vanishing after the HOA deemed them non-compliant. Jack scrolled through the reports, shaking his head in disbelief. They had gotten away with it for years. The only difference this time, they messed with the wrong family, and now they were about to pay big time. 2 days later, Susan Langley was gone. She hadn't gone down with dignity. There had been no grand speech, no carefully crafted farewell letter filled with fake humility and regret. No, she had been forced out. The HOA board had panicked under the pressure, their carefully curated world of petty power plays crumbling beneath the weight of federal scrutiny. Sponsors pulled out, lawyers got involved. Angry homeowners, who had once feared Susan, turned on her like a pack of wolves. And the final nail in the coffin, her own board members voted for her removal. They held an emergency meeting behind closed doors, and within an hour, Susan Langley, the woman who had ruled the HOA with an iron fist for over a decade, was thrown out like last week's trash. Jack should have felt satisfied, should have felt vindicated. But as he stood there, watching the news break across every major outlet, watching the former HOA president flee the neighborhood with her reputation in tatters, he realized something. It wasn't enough. Not for him. Not for his grandfather. Because while Susan Langley could disappear into the shadows, licking her wounds and drowning in disgrace, his grandfather's memorial was still gone. And that was something Jack couldn't accept. He stormed into the HOA office, now under new, terrified management, and slammed his hands down on the front desk. Where's the memorial? The new HOA president, a frazzled, middle-aged man who clearly wanted nothing to do with this mess, winced at Jack's tone. We're working on it, he said, adjusting his tie, his voice far too nervous for Jack's liking. We've sent workers to dig through landfill records. We're calling the sanitation department, tracing where... Jack's patience snapped. Where is it? The man flinched. Behind him, 2 HOA employees sat at their desks, typing furiously, scrolling through records, sweating bullets. But deep down, Jack already knew the truth. The damage had been done. His grandfather's memorial, the handcrafted casket, the folded flag, the war medals, the diary, all of it was gone. Lost. Forever. Jack felt something inside him sink. For days, he had been running on rage, on the pure fire of getting justice. He had fought. He had won. But this was different. This was permanent. His fists clenched at his sides. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He forced himself to breathe through his nose, to keep it together, to not let the grief eat him alive. But then, a voice spoke from behind him. Mr. Henderson? Jack turned. A man in uniform, military, crisp, high-ranking, stood in the doorway. His expression was serious, but there was something steady in his gaze, something solid. Jack straightened. Yeah? The officer stepped forward. We may have lost the original, he said, his voice measured, respectful, but the Pentagon wants to give your grandfather the honor he deserves. Jack blinked. The words settled over him like a slow-moving storm. Then, for the first time in days, maybe weeks, He finally let himself breathe. A week later, Jack stood in Arlington National Cemetery, the crisp autumn air settling around him like a heavy, unseen weight. The rows of white headstones stretched into the horizon, each marking the life of someone who had given everything for this country. Today, his grandfather would take his place among them. It wasn't the way Jack had imagined it. He had thought the casket-shaped memorial would stand in their family forever, passed down just like the stories of Walter Henderson's bravery. He had thought the medals, the folded flag, the diary filled with a soldier's thoughts would be something he could show his future kids, something that would last. The HOA had taken that away, but they hadn't won, because now, the entire nation was watching. The ceremony was nothing short of extraordinary. The Pentagon had gone all out, because this wasn't just about one soldier. This was about every veteran who had ever had their memory disrespected, about every family who had ever been forced to fight for the honor of their loved ones long after the war had ended. A full military color guard stood in formation. Soldiers in full dress uniform moved with perfect precision, every step measured, every motion deliberate. The sound of polished boots against the pavement was sharp, commanding, final. High-ranking military officials stood solemnly, their presence a silent acknowledgement that Captain Walter Henderson's name would not be erased. Jack watched as a young officer stepped forward, carrying a pristine, tightly folded American flag in his gloved hands. His heart pounded in his chest, not from anger this time, not from the fire of battle or the bitterness of loss. This was something else, something heavier, something that settled deep in his bones and would never leave him. The officer approached, his posture stiff with respect. He extended the flag toward Jack, his gaze steady. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, the officer said, voice unwavering, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your grandfather's honorable and faithful service. Jack swallowed hard, his throat tightening as he reached out, his hands closing over the folded fabric. Your grandfather will never be forgotten, the officer added. Jack nodded. He couldn't speak, could barely breathe, because in that moment, standing in the heart of Arlington, surrounded by those who understood what sacrifice meant, he knew it was true. Walter Henderson was more than a man, more than a soldier. He was a legacy, and no amount of bureaucracy, no power-hungry HOA board, no one on this earth could take that away. The final gut punch, the HOA was forced to pay for every single penny of the ceremony, the cost of the military funeral, the new bronze plaque in Walter Henderson's name, the special posthumous Medal of Recognition issued by the Pentagon itself. Every last dollar came straight from their pockets. Jack had made sure of that. And as he stood there, gripping the flag his grandfather had once fought under, he couldn't help but let out a slow, satisfied breath. This was justice. The HOA was in shambles, not just shaken, not just struggling. It was collapsing, disintegrating, imploding under the sheer weight of its own arrogance and corruption. The lawsuits came first. Like a tsunami, they crashed down on what remained of the once powerful organization. Angry homeowners, military families, veteran advocacy groups, everyone wanted a piece. Some sued for damages, others sued for emotional distress. The biggest cases? Those came from the families who had also lost something to the HOA's never-ending obsession with community aesthetics. Because, as it turned out, Walter Henderson's memorial wasn't the first one they'd thrown away. The investigations uncovered years of HOA overreach, countless unreported removals of veteran displays, family tributes, even small plaques honoring loved ones. It had all been done quietly, under the guise of upholding community standards, buried in bureaucratic nonsense and vague policies. But now it was all coming to light. The HOA was drowning, financially, ruined, legally, under siege, publicly, shredded apart by every news outlet in the country. Jack kept an eye on every single lawsuit, watched as HOA representatives scrambled, stuttered, tried to explain themselves in courtrooms packed with veterans, grieving families, and homeowners who were done being bullied. But the best part, the law changed. The outrage had reached Congress. Within weeks, new legislation was introduced at both state and federal levels, laws that ensured no HOA, no neighborhood association, No power-hungry suburban dictator would ever be able to touch a veterans memorial again. It was permanent. No loopholes, no gray areas. From now on, any HOA caught interfering with a military tribute, no matter how big or small, would face severe legal consequences. And that was a victory bigger than anything Jack could have imagined. But as much as he loved watching the HOA burn, there was one thing he enjoyed even more: watching Susan Langley fall. Susan had spent years controlling others. She had built her reputation as the untouchable queen of the HOA, the woman who could make or break anyone in the neighborhood with a single complaint, a single fine, a single coldly worded email. She thrived on the power. She fed off the fear. And now, she had none of it. Jack made sure her downfall was public. Every news article, every interview, every humiliating clip of her stammering through press conferences, sweating bullets as reporters tore her apart. She had no escape. She tried to issue a public apology, but no one cared. She tried to play the victim, but the internet wasn't having it. She tried to salvage what little was left of her career, but the damage was too deep. By the time the lawsuits were finished chewing her to pieces, she was a ghost. No one would hire her. No one would take her seriously. She was done. And then came the final cherry on top. Her own house was foreclosed. The HOA, her empire, her kingdom, her legacy of petty tyranny, was so far in the red from lawsuits and legal fees that they couldn't pay their own debts. And Susan Langley, the woman who had fined homeowners for leaving their trash bins out too long, the woman who had threatened foreclosure over flower beds that didn't match the neighborhood palette, she lost everything. Jack found out from a news article. The photo attached. Susan, standing in her front yard, watching as movers hauled her furniture away, her face twisted in shock, humiliation, and disbelief. Jack had to grin. If that wasn't poetic justice, he didn't know what was. A few weeks later, he stood in front of his grandfather's new memorial. It wasn't the original casket-shaped display, the one his family had cherished for generations. That had been lost forever, but what stood here now, this was bigger, stronger. A bronze plaque mounted on a stone pedestal set in the heart of town. The inscription: Captain Walter Henderson, war hero, beloved father, defender of freedom, honored by the United States military. Jack traced his fingers over the letters, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingertips. He let out a breath. Slow, steady. Then he smiled. "We won, Grandpa," he whispered. And for the briefest moment, the wind shifted. A soft, warm breeze curled around him, rustling the trees, moving through the air like something alive. And maybe, just maybe, he could almost hear it. A low, proud chuckle on the wind,